Welcome to Backup Exec 2012. In this lesson, we're going to talk about backing up your data. If you're following along in the book, we're in Lesson 5. We will talk about backup job basics. There are 4 questions that you have to answer to create any backup job. Backup Exec walks you right through those questions, so we'll take a look at that. We'll also look at the concept of what is a backup definition. This is new to this version of the product. So we'll take a look at creating backup definitions. And how do I configure my backup jobs? How do I create them? How do I add servers that I need to back up? And how do I create server groups and I can apply a backup definition to a whole group of servers all at the same time? Then we'll take a look at the backup workflow. And this is what kinds of things do you want to do for this backup? I want to do a backup to disk and duplicate that off to tape and convert it to a virtual machine. That's a workflow. So we'll take a look at the different workflows that you can do. How do I run a backup job? By default, they run on a schedule, so we'll take a look at running them manually. And then we'll take a look at the backup and restore view and look at the components of that view. This has changed with this version of the product, if you're familiar with the older ones. So we'll take a look at how it's changed. And then we're going to go into GRT-enabled backups. GRT is granular recovery technology, how it's used and why you care. How do I determine if a file has been backed up? So we'll take a look at how Backup Exec shows you your files, and then we'll talk for a moment about system state backup and the importance to your backup jobs and the effect it has of your jobs and what you can do with system state backups. So let's start with backup job basics. There are 4 questions that you have to answer to create any backup job. The first one is, what are you backing up? So in the case of Backup Exec 2012, you begin your backup by saying what you're going to back up. I'm going to back up this server or this group of servers. So it's right up front for you. When do you want the job to run? That's the schedule. Where do you want the backup to go? Symantec recommends that backups be run to disk first, and then if you choose to, you can back them up to tape, duplicate that off to tape. How do you want the backup to run covers a lot of ground. It can be, is this a full, is it an incremental? But it's also against which network card would you like this to run? Do you want to use snapshots? Do you need to run commands before or after the job? So we'll take a look at the different things you can configure for how your backup job runs. So if you can answer those 4 questions, what am I backing up? When does the backup run? Where does it go? And how does it run? That's a backup definition. Normally, when they teach you good writing skills, they teach you that there are 5 questions. Often who is one of them. Who in this case is credentials, but the one I'm looking for here is why. Why do you care about backups? And it's mostly both so that you can do restores. So backup is just a way of being able to do restores. There are several backup methods that you can use, and when you configure a job you must select at least one of them. The first one is a full. Computers are very literal. And a full backup backs up whatever you tell it to back up. It's going to back up everything you tell it to, regardless of whether it's been backed up recently or not. So a full backup backs up everything selected, regardless of whether or not it's changed. It also resets, and I'll talk in a few moments about what is getting reset. So a full backup backs up whatever you tell it to, everything you tell it to, and then resets. A differential backup backs up everything that's changed since the last full backup. So if I run differentials on Monday, I'm going to back up Monday's changes. On Tuesday, I'm going to back up Monday and Tuesday's changes. On Wednesday, I'm going to back up Monday's, Tuesday's, and Wednesday's changes. The advantage to running a differential backup is that on the restore side, all I have to restore is the latest full and the latest differential. There's a rule for running these types of backups, and that is the longer the backup, the shorter the restore. The longer the restore, the shorter the backup. So a full backup is the longest backup that I can run. I back up the most things, and I back it up all the time, regardless of whether it's been backed up or not before. But it's also my shortest restore. If I have to restore that server, all I have to restore is the last full. A differential is a shorter backup, but it's also a shorter restore. It's right in the middle. So a differential, on the restore side, I have to restore the last full and the most recent differential. But I don't have to restore the differentials in between. So by Friday, when I've backed up all the changes all week, all I have to restore is the last full and Friday's differential. And all those changes are going to be included in that last differential. A differential does not reset. The shortest backup I can run, which is also my longest restore, is an incremental backup. And an incremental backs up everything that's changed since the last backup, regardless of what type of backup it was. So if I run my full, in the example we see here on Sunday, and I run an incremental on Monday, I'm backing up only Monday's changes. On Tuesday, I'm backing up only Tuesday's changes. On Wednesday, I'm backing up only Wednesday's changes. So it's my shortest backup. But on the restore side, I have to restore the latest full and every incremental since that full in order. So it's my longest restore. Incrementals reset. So the two that reset are full and incremental. Differential does not reset. So in this activity, what we're going to do is take a look at the different backup methods and what media storage is required. So a full backup requires that you use the most storage. So a full backup uses the most storage. A full and incremental requires the least storage because I'm only backing up the things that have changed. So a full and differential is somewhere in the middle. So as far as storage goes, a full uses the most, full and incremental uses the least. In the backup window, how long does it take the backup to run? Full is the longest. It's backing up the most amount of data. Incremental is the shortest. It's backing up the least amount of data. So again, differential is somewhere in the middle. As far as recovery time goes, this trend that we've been seeing is reversed. The incremental is the longest recovery time. It's the shortest backup. It requires the least media, but it is the longest recovery time. A full is the shortest recovery time. So it requires the most media, the longest time to do, but the shortest time to restore. And again, differential is somewhere in the middle. As a backup administrator, your job is to balance these pros and cons. Understanding that you may have a requirement that says this server can only be down for a short period of time. If you have that requirement, you have to back it up in such a way that you can recover it as quickly as possible, which may be a full every night. So your job is to balance the idea that the longest backup is the shortest restore. The shortest restore is the longest backup. So you have to balance all that out, and that's really what this activity is pointing at. The other thought that you have here on fulls and differentials and incrementals is that you can't mix them. If I was doing fulls and differentials, because I understand that that's the very middle of the road, it's not the longest backup that I can run, it's shorter than a full, but it's a faster restore, and I'm running out of time. By the end of the week, I'm getting down to the point that it's taking too long for the backup to run, and I have to change over to incrementals. You must run a full before you can change from differential to incremental. Backup Exec understands that you can't mix these, and the interface won't let you mix them. So it will require that you run that full before it allows you to change over from a differential to an incremental. And we'll see that when we look at the backup definitions. So a full backup has several advantages. It consolidates everything into one set of media. When I run a full backup, it may span several tapes, but everything I need to do to restore is on that set of tapes in order. So it's the fastest disaster recovery. And everything that I need to do that restore is right there at my fingertips. The disadvantage is that it is the longest backup that you can run, and you're repeatedly backing up the same things over and over and over again. Differential backups have the advantage of being faster than a full. It's backing up only the things that have changed since the last full, so it's a very easy restore. I restore the last full, most recent differential, and all as well. The disadvantages are that you're backing up the same things over and over and over again. So my backups get progressively larger. On Monday, I back up only Monday's changes, but by Friday, I'm backing up all the changes that have occurred all week. So they occupy more space in your storage, and they get progressively longer as the week goes on. Incremental backups are a better use of storage. You're only backing up the things that have changed. It's a very fast backup. I only need to back up a few things, but it's a much longer restore. And in the case of things like databases, if you get the incremental restores out of order, then the database services often will not even start. So on the restore side, you must not only restore the last full and every incremental since then, but you must restore them in the correct order. So there's a much greater chance for error, both human error and media error, because we have so many different tapes that we're using. So we've got some new terms for how backups are done in Backup Exec 2012. In Backup Exec 2010 and earlier, we had policies that had building blocks that were called templates. In Backup Exec 2012, you have a backup definition that has stages, and we'll take a look at what that means for you. So backup definition is, what are you backing up? Right? Remember my 4 questions. My backup selections are, what am I backing up? And that's always where you start the job, is by selecting the server that you wish to back up. In the job is where you set, when do I want it to run? How do I want it to run? And where do I want it to go? So that's all my jobs and settings. Stages have to do with, I may want to do something with that backup. I may want to run my backup to disk and duplicate it to tape. That's a stage. Or I may want to take that backup and convert it to a virtual machine. That's a stage. So you can add as many stages as are appropriate for your environment. So we'll start with the backup selections. It starts by clicking on your server and saying, create a backup. We'll take a look at that screen in a moment. The screen in the background on this screenshot is the first one that comes up that gives you just a very broad view of your server. It tells you that you're backing up these things on your server. If you go to click the Edit button, you will come into the backup selection screen that gives you a much more detailed view of what you're backing up on that server. This would look familiar to those of you who came from the older versions of Backup Exec. Several things I want to point out on these screenshots. In the backup selection screen, at the top you see Simplified Disaster Recovery is turned on. That means that I am backing up all of the critical components of this server, and if I had to recover this server from the dead, that everything that I need to do so is already being backed up. And we'll talk about, we have a whole lesson on Simplified Disaster Recovery. In the backup properties screenshot, you see the same thing about Simplified Disaster Recovery, but it's simply that little green circle that is beside the server name toward the top of that screen. So this screen works the same as it has in older versions of Backup Exec. If I get into the backup selection screen, and I click a checkbox, it means that everything from that point down is being backed up. This version of Backup Exec does something called dynamic inclusion. And what that says is if I were to tick the checkbox for the server as a whole, in this example it's cl.example.com, I tick the checkbox for a server as a whole, and right now today it's backing up the C drive, SQL, and system state. If I were to add another volume to that server, so now I have a D drive available, dynamic inclusion says, even though when you created this backup you didn't tick the checkbox for D, at runtime we're going to go out and look at this server and say, now you have a D drive, so we're going to include it in your backup. So if you tick the checkbox for what you're backing up at the highest level possible, it allows you to make changes to that server, but those changes will be dynamically included in your backup job. If you want to specifically exclude something, the rule is the same. You need to tick the checkbox at the highest level possible, but then drill down in the backup selection screen and unmark the things that you want to exclude. So a good example here would be to unmark the recycler. I don't need to backup recycler. But if I leave the box marked at the high level, then I still get dynamic inclusion. So you can uncheck things at a lower level and still have dynamic inclusion. When you mark or unmark these boxes, it creates a hard-coded list of what you're backing up and what you're excluding. And that hard-coded list is displayed on the next tab over that says Selection Details. So dynamic inclusion allows us to have an implicit selection. It says at runtime, you told me to back up this server, so I don't care what volumes the server has, I'm going to back them all up. And so if we were to look at the selection details screen, it says include star.star. So devices and volumes are dynamically discovered, automatically protected at runtime. And then you can explicitly include or exclude them, like the example I gave earlier of unchecking the recycler. But what that does is it allows us to continue to protect the entire server. You can also tell Backup Exec globally to go out and say, when should I run a discovery for things that need to be backed up in my environment? Are there new servers that were brought online that perhaps I didn't know about? And then Backup Exec can tell you that you need to be backing up this server. What you're seeing here are the defaults. If I click on the Backup Exec button and go to Configuration and Settings, Backup Exec Settings, Discover Data, you'll see that Backup Exec by default is going to query your network every day to find anything that you're not backing up and let you know that this is on your network and available to be backed up. So a backup definition is what replaces the old jobs in older versions of Backup Exec. So a backup definition always contains at least one job, usually a full if it's only one, and recurring jobs can be the partials, either incrementals or differentials. You can set the default options and you can override the default options at any point. When I create new backup jobs, the jobs will inherit the default settings that you have configured. So if you change them from what's installed, any new jobs will have those new settings. Stages have to do with if I need to do something with a backup job. So I can duplicate a backup job to another disk. Let's say that I have a small offsite facility where we put in a Backup Exec appliance that ran the backups to disk. I want to duplicate those to a disk that's in my data center. So I can do a duplicate to disk. And in the data center, I'm going to take all of that data and duplicate it off to tape for longer term storage. So in my example, I would have a backup job with two stages, one that duplicates it to disk in the data center and one that duplicates it to tape for long-term storage. I can also have stages that convert to virtual machines. So I can do that conversion after the backup has finished, and I can schedule the conversion to run. We have a whole lesson on conversions. And then I can also run the conversion simultaneously with the backup. If you choose to do this, it can only write at the speed of the slowest stage. So in many cases, it's more efficient to run the backup and then later do the conversion to virtual. But you can do it as makes sense in your environment. The other stage that I have is archive, and this has to do with taking the data off of its primary location, maybe my Exchange server, and storing it in a vault, which is drive space that Backup Exec is going to manage. Once you back up that drive space that Backup Exec manages, Backup Exec will go out and delete the data from the original source so that it no longer lives on the Exchange server or the file system server. That data exists only in the vault and the backup of the vault. To configure my backup jobs so that they run the way I want them to, there is an add server wizard that will find that you can manually add servers. By default, Backup Exec is going to go out and look for servers that need to be backed up on your network. We saw that setting earlier. I need to add an agent to any machine that I want to back up. So the remote agent for Windows or the remote agent for Linux must be installed on any machine that I wish to back up. I can add whatever servers I need to in some cases for things like SharePoint and Enterprise Vault and Microsoft Exchange. You have what are called distributed installations. So for SharePoint, I might have an IIS server, I might have another server that is running SQL, and yet another server where I house the documents and PowerPoints that I'm sharing with SharePoint. In the case of Backup Exec needs to know where all three of those servers are. And so when I add a server, it's very important that you add one of the servers that knows where the other ones are. We'll take a look at that here in just a moment. You can add whatever servers are in your environment. So Linux computers, Macintosh computers, VMware vCenter is a Windows machine that knows about all of the ESX Linux hosts and all of their guests. So if I add the VMware vCenter server, then Backup Exec will automatically go find all of the ESX servers and all of the guests that they house. The agent for Windows needs to be installed on any Windows machine that I wish to back up. The agent for Linux needs to be installed on any Linux machine that I wish to back up. To add a server, I go to the Backup and Restore tab, click the Add button in the ribbon, and it will ask me what type of server do I wish to add. In this case, we're going to add a Microsoft Windows machine. And it's going to ask you if you want to establish a trust. This trust has nothing to do with Windows and is specific to Backup Exec. The trust is a certificate that is being placed on the remote machine so that when a backup kicks off and the backup server says, hey, you, remote machine, give me all your data, the remote machine is going to say, who are you? Do you have a certificate that can prove who you are? So this trust is a trust relationship between the Backup Exec server and the remote machine being backed up. If you do not tick the checkbox that says allow Backup Exec to establish the trust, you cannot install the agent. You must have that trust relationship in order to have an agent, and you can't back up the machine without an agent. So the trust relationship is strictly a Backup Exec thing. You can tell it which servers you want to add if you wanted to add multiple servers. You can add it by IP address, which routes the traffic through that IP address. You can browse for it across the network, which is an LDAP browse. You can add it using a short name, just the host name, or you can add it using an FQDN, a fully qualified domain name, which is the hostname.domain.extension. I have to specify what logon account is going to be used to connect to that server. Depending on the server, you will need to set this logon account so that it can access the data. An easy example here is SQL. I can install SQL so that it is in a SQL mode, meaning that I have to have a specific username and account to SQL that is separate from Windows. So in this case, I would need to have an account that has access to that SQL database in order to back it up. So I can specify what account I want to use. You can also tell Backup Exec if you want it to upgrade the agent from a previous version or a patched version. So I can just tick the checkbox that says to upgrade the agent, and it will upgrade the agent for me automatically. You also notice that there's a checkbox here to restart the remote machine if that's required. Whether or not it's required depends on the operating system of the remote machine and what happened in the package that does that upgrade. If you leave this box unchecked, it will not upgrade the agent until you reboot on your regular maintenance cycle. And in many cases, there are advantages to waiting for that reboot. Just understand that it will still be the old agent until the reboot occurs. It will then show you that it's installing the agent. We like successful. Hopefully it says successful. And it will tell you whether or not a restart is required. If for some reason the agent installation fails, it will tell you here why it failed and the path to the log files that you can go to troubleshoot why it failed. Failures can occur because of the Windows firewall. That's one of the most common, or because of trouble passing that certificate that's involved in that trust. And there are some good knowledge-based articles for troubleshooting that, and many times those will be presented directly on this screen. I can also create groups of servers. So if Backup Exec just found all the servers in my environment, which it automatically will, or you manually created them, I can create groups of servers so that I can sort by group, or I can apply backups by group. So server groups help you manage and monitor the machines on your network, but they also help you manage and monitor the backups that are associated with those servers. A server can be a member of multiple server groups, so it can belong to multiple groups. I can back up the entire server group at one time. It makes sense if you create groups based on data type. So if I have 3 SQL servers, I'm going to create a group for SQL servers. They can be grouped based on geographical location, by applications, by data type. You can create whatever groups are particular to administrators for those groups. So if I have administrators for SQL, I can create a SQL group. If I have administrators for Exchange, I can create an Exchange group. For any kind of political reason or geographical or data type reason you want to create groups, it just makes things easier to manage. There are also filters that you can use. So if you see a very long list of servers to be backed up, you can go to the filters and say, show me only the machines that are running Oracle, or show me only machines that have failed backups. So this is a different way of sorting, but it's a very fast and easy way to see the machines that you're interested in seeing. To add a server group, you just tell it that you want to create a new server group. You give your group a name, and then you tell it the type of servers that you want to put in that group. And it will show you a list at the bottom of the screen of all the servers that it has found that meet your criteria, and you tick the checkbox for the servers that you want to include in the group. And then you click OK, and it becomes part of a group. To create a backup job, then, I can highlight the server or the group, and then click the backup button at the top of the screen. And in our case, we're going to say backup to disk. And you can right-click on any server or group and say backup to disk as well. You don't have to click the backup button. If you want to do a one-time backup, that is a non-recurring backup, you can also do that. If you have an existing backup, you can create a new backup from that old one. So you can copy an existing backup and create a new one as well. So in our case, what we're going to do is say backup to disk, regardless of how you got there. And what you will see is, in our case, we have selected a single server. So we see all the volumes for that server. You'll notice at the top of the screen, beside the server name, you have the little green circle that says that the simplified disaster recovery is enabled. It means that I'm backing up all the critical data on that server to do a full disaster recovery if I had to. On the right, it shows you the workflow. What kind of backups are you running? So we see in this screenshot that we're running a full backup and an incremental. You can test the credentials that are being used to connect to that server. So if you click the Test Credentials button, it will come up to a screen that allows you to select which credentials you wish to use and make sure that they can connect to read the data. So when I tell it to test credentials, I come into a screen that shows me each volume and each application, because I may have to use different credentials for these. In this case, SQL may have to have a SQL account. You can just say test all, and it will show you whether or not it's able to connect, and that this indicates that at least this part of the backup would be successful. If I want to edit the selections, I go back to the screen where we saw the properties and click the edit button, and it will show me details of the selections that you wish to back up. Again, that simplified disaster recovery is a banner at the top that shows me that it's on, and you have the whole dynamic inclusion. That means that I need to check the boxes at the highest level possible, and then if I want to exclude something, drill down into it and exclude it at a lower level to maintain my dynamic inclusion. On the right, you see backup selections if I have selected multiple computers. So if I had selected a group of computers, it will show me the selections for all of those. Simplified disaster recovery is very important not only for disaster recovery, but it is required if you want to do conversions. So if I want to do a backup and convert that to a virtual machine, or I want to do a backup and have the option at some time later of converting that backup set to a virtual machine, simplified disaster recovery must be enabled. If it's not enabled, you are not allowed to do the conversions or the simplified disaster recovery. And we have a whole lesson on that, but it means that I have all of the critical components for that server selected in this selection list. So if I want to add a backup to this, so in my case we're doing a full backup and an incremental backup. If I want to add another full to this perhaps, to do a grandfather, father, son rotation, I would click the edit button, and it brings me into a screen where I can select the type of backup that I want to run. To do a grandfather, father, son, it means that I have a monthly full, a weekly full, and a daily, in this case incremental, but it could be a differential. So you can just add whatever type of backup you want to add. So in this case we could add another full, and you schedule when you want that backup to run. So this is my schedule. You will also notice when you look at this screen that you cannot mix incremental and differential. If you already have one selected, then that's the only one that you can select for additional jobs. So that's where I can add backups by method, and it will tell you that you cannot combine incrementals and differentials, but you can delete the incremental and change it over to a differential if you choose to. If you come down after schedule, coming down the left side, storage is where do you want the job to go. So far we have looked at what are you backing up, when do you want it to run. Now we're saying where do you want the job to go. Semantic recommends that all backups be written to disk, and then if you want to write them to tape, later duplicate them off to tape. So that's an additional stage in your backup definition. So this is where I can select the storage. The next under storage, the next entry down is keep for. This is how long will that data remain on your disk storage. So if it's written to disk, this is your data lifecycle management. You can also choose compression and encryption here. The next option we can set is network. Which network interface card do you wish to use? You can select that here. If you leave it at default, it will just choose any available. Notification is when the job runs, do I wish to email someone that this job has completed? So I can also manage recipients from this screen. That's new to this version. In prior versions, you had to have the recipients already selected, already configured. Verifies. Verify means that when the backup runs, we're going to keep track of how much data we backed up. And we create a database entry that says we backed up X amount of data. When you run a verify, all it does is look in the storage area, in this case disk, and look and measure how much data is in that storage for that backup. It compares that to what's in the database. So a verify simply says we backed up X amount of data when the backup ran. We're going to go back and look at the storage and make sure that X amount of data is in storage. Semantic recommends that you run verifies for all of your jobs. It's a good way to make sure that the data that you backed up is indeed in the storage. However, verifies can add time. They take longer to run. So if I have a very short backup window and all I can get done in the evenings is run my backups, I don't have time to do verifies at night, you can run verifies later. So I can schedule when the verifies run. So I can say after the job finishes or on a separate schedule. And that's the options that you see here on this screen. So a best practice is to let your jobs run during your backup window, and if you don't have time to do verifies at that point, schedule them to run at a later time. But it is a really good idea to verify as many as you can. Keep in mind that verify adds no network traffic because we're not verifying it from the original source, right? We're verifying it against what's in storage and that database entry. And that verify does not necessarily mean that everything you backed up is a valid file. If the file was corrupt on the source and I backed it up, it's still going to be a corrupt file in the backup. But we backed up X amount of data and the verifies will succeed. So the only way to make sure that what you backed up was truly valid data is to do restores. Verifies are helpful, but you need to do test restores as well. The next option is Advanced Open File. By default, Backup Exec will back up open files using snapshot technology. On Windows machines, this is using the Microsoft Volume Shadow Copy Service, or VSS. You'll notice here that this is automatically turned on, and that the default is to automatically select the snapshot technology. So we will use VSS. We have a whole section on this later in this material. VSS can also call other snapshot providers. So if I choose to, I can tell it to just go to that snapshot provider. Checkpoint Restart is new to this version of Backup Exec, and what that means is when the backup kicks off, you told Backup Exec to back up a whole list of files. And at the beginning of the backup, Backup Exec is going to say these files on the list are open. VSS, please create a snapshot. So VSS will create a snapshot of the open files and put that in a cache location. As the backup is running, we go down the list and back up the files, and when we hit an open file, we won't back up the open file, we'll back it up from the cache. But we'll also put markers in the cache that say this is the last time that we were able to do a backup. If the backup should fail for some reason, with Checkpoint Restart, when the backup restarts again, it will go back to that marker and run the backup from that point down. So it knows that it needs to restart the backup without rerunning the entire backup. It's a very cool new feature. Security options have to do with the semantic published threat con. This is what threats to your servers exist in the wild. In the wild meaning in the whole world. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've been invaded by a virus, but this says that there is a threat in the whole world right now for viruses or other rootkits or botkits or threats to your computer. And I can tell Backup Exec to run a job immediately when the threat con level hits a specific level. And you'll see here that by default it's level 2, which is elevated. This also means that your Backup Exec server must have access to the internet so that it can query Symantec's website to find out what this threat con level is. This is a really good setting for machines that exist in, let's say, a DMZ, that have access to my end users that are at a higher risk for being invaded by some kind of malicious software, rather than servers that are inside of a firewall. Pre and post commands are commands that I can run before or after any job. You can run any kind of script here that you need to. And you'll notice that there are pre and post commands for all the different types of jobs that you have configured. So in this case we have pre and post for the full and pre and post for the incremental. Files and folders. This has to do with what is being reset. When I was discussing fulls, incrementals, and differentials, I said that fulls reset. The default for this version of Backup Exec is that we determine what is going to be backed up based on a Windows box, modified time, and the Windows change journal. This is different than older versions of Backup Exec. Older versions of Backup Exec determined what we were going to back up based on the archive bit, which the archive bit is a property of a file. At the end of a full backup, if you're backing up based on modified time and the change journal, then Backup Exec will reset the Windows change journal, and that way it knows that the full backup completed. The Windows change journal will then keep track of any files that have changed or moved, and when we run the incremental backup, all we have to do is open up that change journal, and now you have a list of all the files that have changed or moved. So the incremental backup only has to go down that list. At the end of the incremental backup, because incrementals reset, we'll put a marker in there that says this is where we ran the incremental. And then the change journal will continue to keep track of all the files that moved or changed. The other option is to do backups based on archive bit, which is how older versions of Backup Exec ran. Archive bits are properties of DOS-based files. So Windows machines have archive bits. And at the beginning of a backup for an incremental, we would have to scan for all the files that had the archive bit turned on. At the end of the incremental, we would have to go turn all those archive bits back off again because incrementals reset. So that's a big change for this version of Backup Exec. For non-DOS based machines, this is Linux and Macintosh, you don't have a change journal and you don't have archive bits. So the way those Backup Exec determines what we need to back up on those machines in the case of an incremental or a differential is by modified time. And when we back up a file, we're going to keep a record of the modified time in the database. The next time we back up that machine, we're going to look at the existing modified time and compare it to what's in the database and say they have a different time, we need to back up this file. So for Linux and Macintosh machines, everything is based on modified time. You can also come in here and explicitly exclude anything that you need to. If you mark the boxes at the highest level, these are the backup defaults. This is the default for creating all backup jobs. I can say always exclude recycler or always exclude temp files. You can override that in a specific job, but this would mean that on a general basis you always want to exclude something in particular. Temp files are good examples. Core files would be another good example. So what we're looking at here is my backup workflow, my backup definition that shows me what I'm backing up, where it's going, right? That's my storage, when it's running, and how it's running. In this case, we've got the full and the incremental. So all 4 questions are answered directly on this screen. What am I backing up? When is it running? Where is it going? And how is it being run? You can add whatever stage you need to. So I can add a stage for backup to disk, or duplicate to tape, or convert to virtual. These are things that I need to do in addition to the backup, and I can add stages for the different schedules that are in the backup. So in this case, we're going to say add a stage, and in this case we're going to say duplicate. So what are we going to duplicate? And I can set a schedule for my duplicate. If I edit the stage, I can then say what the schedule is for the duplicate. When do I want it to run? In the duplicate, I can say when do I want the duplicate to run. So I can run my backups at night when it's the least impact on my users, but I can run my duplicates during the day when it's all local to the backup exec server. So here I can say that I want to run it according to a schedule, or I can run it immediately after the backup completes. You'll notice coming down the left side that I can also specify the storage. So do I want to do a duplicate to which kind of disk or which tape? And I can also set up notifications and verifies for the duplicate job, just as we discussed for the regular backup jobs. If I drill down into a server, so if I go to the Backup and Restore tab and I double click on any server, what I can see for that server is the backup definitions that have been created for that server, and you can then expand that definition to see all of the jobs that are associated with that definition. In this case, we have a full, an incremental, a duplicate, and a verified job. So this replaces the Job Setup tab that you saw in older versions of Backup Exec. If I have selected a group of servers, or I have highlighted multiple servers using the Shift or Control key, I can still run a backup, but it's going to show me now that my backups apply to multiple servers. So in the selection screen looks different. And you'll notice that instead of having the circle that with the eye at the top, the green circle that shows my simplified disaster recovery is enabled, instead of that being at the top of the screen, it's associated now with each server that's on the list. If I click the Edit button, it will come back and show me the same details that we saw earlier, but it's for all the servers that have all the same things. So I can edit multiple backup jobs at the same time. I can do that by clicking on Edit Backups and typing in the type of backup that I'm looking for, or the name has this part of a backup in it, and it will then show me all the jobs that meet that criteria, and I can edit them all at the same time. I can also edit duplicate options, so I can say to which storage does this duplicate job go. I want this one to go to tape, and then I'm going to do a duplicate to disk, and then another duplicate to tape. I can change that as I need to. And the keep for in this case is because we're going to a storage device. We're going to a backup to disk location. If I were going to a tape location, it would ask me the media set. But I can also then see how long I need to keep it, and I can change. In this case, we're going to disk, so I can change that time frame as I need. If I want to edit the defaults for how backup jobs run, I need to click on the Backup Exec button, click on Configuration and Settings, and then go to Job Defaults, and then you can set the job defaults for the list that you see here. If I click the Backup to Disk, then I get into the screen where I can set my default schedule. You can override this in an individual job, set any of the default options that we have talked about. To run a backup job, by default they'll run on a schedule, but I can also right click on the job and say Run Now, which means that it is going to run in addition to its existing schedule. I can also look at a job history. So if a job has failed, I can go to the job history, right click on it and say Run Now to get it to try to complete successfully. The backup and restore view is how I see my servers and my jobs. So this replaced the jobs monitor screen and the job setup screen in older versions of Backup Exec. So if I click on the Backup and Restore tab, by default what I'm going to see is a list of all the servers that Backup Exec knows about in my environment. It will show me this expanded view, which means that I have 2 lines per server. It will show me any alerts that are associated with those servers. You can double click on the alerts here to go clear the alerts. It shows me the status, and it shows me all of the jobs that are running against those servers with the little green indicator that shows the backups were successful and the red indicator to show that we had a problem. The most current day will always be on the far right. This is the default layout for this screen, but you can also change this layout as you need to. So this list includes all the servers that Backup Exec knows about, including servers that are running distributed applications. This includes anything that you have manually added. Any machine that you're backing up must have an agent on it. So if it's a Windows machine, it must have the agent for Windows. If it's Linux, it must have the agent for Linux. I can monitor all my activity from this one window now, and that will look at the date and time of any backups that have run or that are running or that will be running. If you double click on any server from that screen, you go into the details of that window. So now I can see the jobs that are running against that server. And you can expand any of the backup definitions that have multiple schedules or stages for that backup definition. You can also run jobs from here. So the default servers list shows me the status, the last 7 days. It shows me, if you scroll across, it will show me the next time that it's due to be backed up. But you can also change these columns to display what you are interested in seeing. So the details will show me that I have run, in this example, we've run backups every day since last Friday, and that Wednesday's backup had a problem. You can double click on these and it will then show you details of what happened in those jobs. So if I'm looking at the server list, I see the whole list of servers. You can highlight a server and go to the details about it, or you can double click on it. Either way will get you to details. And this is where I see the jobs. The next option down on the left from jobs is job history. So job history is where I can go and see when the jobs ran, each of their successful. So this is more than 7 days worth of history. But this is also where I can right click on the job history and look at the job log. So if you're trying to troubleshoot why a job had issues, you can go to the job log from here and it will give you any details about that job that will help you troubleshoot. So when I look at the job log, this should look very familiar if you're familiar with older versions of Backup Exec. It shows me all the detailed job information. I can scroll down this list. If there were issues, There will be links in here to what the issue was and how to resolve it. And I also have a tab for job history that will show me details about what ran in that job, what was backed up, how it was backed up, if it was an open file or not. All that information is listed here in the job history. It will also show me if a new device was found. This is new to this version of the product. So in this case, we found a new device on that server. This is that whole automatic inclusion thing. So in this case, it says we did not find, that we found something that was not found in a previous instance of the job, but we're fully going to protect it. So the job logs will tell you that it found something new. It will also tell you if something is missing. So if I had a volume, usually this is going to be a USB drive, that I told it that I wanted to back up the USB drive, but then I unplugged the USB drive, the backups are going to tell me that your USB drive is missing. And so you'll see that in the job log. This may be a failed or completed with exceptions depending on how much data was on that device that is now missing. And so if you permanently want to remove it, you would need to go edit the job to permanently remove that device. It will tell you if critical devices are missing. This would disable the simplified disaster recovery and thus disable any conversions that you had if you were doing convert to virtual. So the job log will tell you that it's missing critical devices. Those are very important to troubleshoot. Backup sets will show me the date and timestamp for everything that we backed up. This is very similar to the old restore screens that you've seen in the past. It will show me all of the date and timestamps for all the backups, and then I can go look at what's included in that. I can delete the backup set if I choose to, or I can catalog it if I need to. Credentials show me the credentials being used. This is the same sort of thing that we saw on the test credentials. This just shows me from a larger view what credentials are being used. And properties show me general information about the particular jobs. I can also look at details for multiple servers. So if I highlight a server group, same thing. It will show me, or I can use the shift or control key to highlight multiple servers. And I'm going to see the same thing. I'll see the jobs, the job history. Logon accounts are going to vary depending on what type of data you're backing up. So the default Backup Exec logon account is the service account that Backup Exec generally uses to browse to that machine and request the data. It's also the account that it will use to do restores. So this account needs to have read and write rights to all the data on the server. The system logon account is used to access the data. It's the Backup Exec Services credentials. And then you have a Backup Exec logon account that manages Backup Exec usernames and passwords. This is logging into the Backup Exec database. So Backup Exec does not create a connection with Windows user accounts. It simply uses them when the backups run or when the restores run, and then it releases that connection to the Windows account. There is a wizard to help you with logon accounts. So if I go to the Backup Exec button and the configuration and settings, I go to logon accounts. I can create a new logon account. This is to log on to Backup Exec. So what credentials do I wish to use? And if I want to make this a common logon or restricted logon, and you'll notice the descriptions here, and it will give you a summary of the logon account that you've just created. You can also manage logon accounts, so I can add them from here. I can change how their credentials work, if they're restricted or default. GRT enabled backups. GRT is granular recovery technology. Granular recovery technology allows us to back up VSS-aware databases, that is Active Directory, Exchange, and SharePoint, and to some extent SQL, as a whole. So we're backing up the entire database. The GRT part allows us to catalog everything that's inside of there and crack open that database so that we can restore individual items. In the case of Exchange, that means that we can back up the entire information store in a single pass, but restore individual emails and individual mailboxes. So GRT-based backups are a little more complicated from the standpoint of we have to back up the entire database, but we also must catalog everything that's inside of there and write that information in such a way that we can restore the individual items. GRT-based backups should always be written to disk. You can duplicate them to tape, but if you duplicate them to tape, or if you write them directly to tape, you have to restore them in sequence. You have to stage the restore. We'll take a look at that. So GRT is what allows me to recover individual items. In the case of virtual machines, we can back up the entire virtual machine and create either a VMDK or a VHD file, but we'll catalog everything in the guest and be able to restore individual files and folders or individual pieces of the VSS-aware databases just as if it were a physical machine. So GRT is the ability to restore those individual items even though we did a very large pass backup. We backed up the entire database or the entire guest if it is a virtual machine. And I can restore either the full backup, I can restore the entire thing, or I can restore individual items. So the applications that support GRT are the VSS-aware applications. This is Microsoft Active Directory, Exchange, SharePoint, and then there are snapshot providers for VMware and Hyper-V that allow us to do GRT against those guests. GRT means that we can recover any of the pieces or parts. So in the case of Active Directory, it means that we can recover an individual item, an individual container or user with its original GUID. We have a whole section on that later in this course material. For Exchange, it means that we can recover individual mailboxes, individual emails, we can recover public folders, specific contacts, any of those little pieces of Exchange. For SharePoint, it means that we can recover individual documents, individual wiki pages, individual lists, right? Anything that's stored within SharePoint. And then for VMware and Hyper-V, it means that we're backing up the entire guest, creating either the VMDK or the VHD file, depending on which one it is, and still being able to look inside of that and recover individual files and folders, individual items. If it were a virtualized Exchange server, you could recover individual email out of that. We recommend that all GRT-based backups go to disk. If you have to write GRT-based backups to tape, on the restore side, we have to restore the entire piece. If it's Exchange, that means the entire information store to a temporary location. Then we can restore the pieces and parts, and then that temporary file gets deleted. If you are doing GRT-based backups to disk, we can read that disk space and simply restore the individual items. We don't have to stage the whole thing back. It should be on a storage device that does not have file size limitations. These catalogs for GRT-based backups can get fairly large. And if you do have file size limitations, then we will require a staging location coming back. The default staging location is SQL and \temp. which means that if I were restoring an Exchange GRT-based backup from tape, I would put the entire Exchange information store in C:\temp. Probably not the path that you intended. Be sure that you edit that path. For GRT-based backups of Active Directory, I can only run full backups. So in my backup definition of my Active Directory server, I said that I wanted to run full backups on Friday and differentials during the week for the entire server. But when we back up Active Directory, it will always be a full, even if everything else is differential. So Active Directory must always be backed up as a full backup. To do GRT-based backups of Exchange, Backup Exec must have access to a mailbox within Exchange that we will use inside of Exchange to catalog everything in Exchange as we back up the entire information store. So Backup Exec must have access to a unique mailbox, and it has to be a valid mailbox. For SharePoint, I must have the agent on all the servers that participate in the SharePoint farm. It's very common for SharePoint to be a distributed installation, meaning that I'm going to run IIS on a web server. I'm going to have a SQL server that's driving the SharePoint databases, and I'm going to have another server that is housing all of the documents that are being shared. In order to back up SharePoint and be able to do granular recovery, I'm going to have an agent for Backup Exec on all three servers. That's also true for Exchange 2010, where you have database availability groups. You must have an agent on all the machines that you will potentially be backing up. For VMware and Hyper-V, I can only recover virtual items if they are Windows guests. I can only do GRT-based backups of Windows guests. You can still have Linux guests on a VMware host, but we can't do a GRT-based backup against that Linux guest. We can still back up the entire guest and get the VMDK file. You just won't have granular recovery unless it's a Windows guest. And in order to restore the individual parts, you must have the agent inside the guest. We have a whole lesson on VMware and Hyper-V later in this course. We'll talk about configuring Backup Exec to determine what files are being backed up. So this has to do with what is being reset when we are doing a full backup or an incremental backup. So modified time allows us to look at all the files and their change time. If it is a Windows machine, you also have a change journal. The Windows change journal always exists. Whether you use it or not, it exists. If you've ever watched very carefully a check disk run, check disk has several stages. The last stage will always say checking USN journal. The USN journal is the change journal. In the case of Backup Exec, what we do is open up the change journal that tracks whether or not files have changed or moved. So on a full backup, what Backup Exec will do is close a change journal entirely and open up a blank new one, meaning it reset. The change journal will then be deleted by the operating system, and now I have a new change journal that they'll keep a record of everything that's changed or moved. In the case of a partial backup, either an incremental or differential, Backup Exec will put a marker inside that change journal that says we ran the backup here. In the case of it, so it's resetting. In the case of an incremental, the next time we run a backup, we'll simply open up the change journal, look for the marker, and then back up everything that's changed since that marker. So by modified time and using the change journal, Backup Exec is saving the time of scanning all the files for archive bits or resetting archive bits. So the new default for Backup Exec is to use the change journal on a Windows machine. On Linux or Macintosh machines that don't have a change journal, we're still using modified time. The older method of running backups, and this is how Backup Exec 2010 and prior ran, was that they use archive bits. Archive bit is a property of a file. It shows whether or not the file has been backed up. So when I run a full backup, it has to go turn off all the archive bits on all the files because it resets. And when I run an incremental backup, it will look for all the files that those archive bits are turned on and back them up, but an incremental backup resets, so it'll go through and turn them all off again. If I ran a full and turned them all off, and I run differential backups, then the differential is simply looking for all the files that the archive bits turned on and backing them up, but it does not reset. All right, so I can reset archive bits. Archive bit-based backups are slower than change journal-based backups when you have a very large number of small files. It's faster to run change journal-based backups against a large number of small files. We can also use the catalogs, and this is how Backup Exec knows whether or not to back up files that have changed on Linux or Unix machines, or Macintosh, sorry, we no longer back up Unix. That what we'll do is on a Linux or a Macintosh, when we back up the file, we'll put a database entry that says, in the catalog, that we'll put an entry that says what the modified time of that file was. The next time we run a backup of that Linux or Macintosh machine, then we'll compare the current modified time to what's in the catalog. If they're different, then we back it up. So the catalogs are used mostly for Linux and Macintosh machines. System state backups are very critical for simplified disaster recovery and for conversions to virtual. So let's take a look at what system state really is. System state is open information that is critical to that server that must be backed up in order to do simplified disaster recovery, but that you can also restore in the case of an emergency. What's new to this version of the product is that we're showing you the pieces of system state differently than we have in the past. One of the big changes that you'll notice is that when I check system state and I look at the components of it, you'll now see Internet Information Services, or IIS. In the past, that was part of shadow copy components. So now system state lists for you all the pieces of system state. You'll notice on the backup side that the only option I have is to back up all of system state. On the backup side, you either back it up or you don't. You can't back up just pieces of system state. Now I want to draw your attention to some of the pieces of system state that are important to you, one of them being the registry. If this were an Active Directory server or a domain controller, Active Directory would also show up here under system state. So when you tick the checkbox for system state and the checkbox for the C drive, simplified disaster recovery will usually be turned on. But you can also turn it on other ways. So what we have talked about here is what's involved in creating a backup. I have to answer 4 questions. How to configure my backup jobs, how to run the backup manually, how to run it according to a schedule, how backups are taken using granular recovery, and then how Backup Exec backs up system state.